I'm Ryan O'Doud, and you're listening to Ryan's Audiobooks on the Issues Magazine YouTube channel. Today we're continuing with section 1111 in The Russian Cosmists, the Esoteric Futurism of Nikolai Fedderov and His Followers by George Young. We pick up at the beginning of chapter 11. Fedorov's 20th century followers. Russian Cosmism did not quite emerge full-blown from the head of Nikolai Fedorovich Fedorov. As much as it owes to him, it would not have emerged without the assiduous devotion of two extraordinary disciples, the educator, law clerk, and later circuit court judge Nikolai Peterson, and the philosopher, poet, and scholar of Eastern religions, Vladimir Kozhevnikov. Nikolai Pavlovich Peterson, 1844 to 1919, and Vladimir Alexandrovich Kozhevnikov, 1852 to 1917. Editor's note, he died the year of the Russian Revolution. Peterson was born in Penza province in central Russia, attended the local gymnasium and Institute for Nobility, and in 1861 entered Moscow University as a student of history and philology, from which he was almost immediately forced to withdraw for lack of means. In 1862, at age 17, he became the youngest of the applicants chosen to teach at Tolstoy's experimental school for peasant children at Yasnaya Polyana, and before the academic year ended, he was appointed secretary of the House Pedagogical Journal. After a year at Tolstoy's school, Peterson returned to Moscow University, this time as a student of medicine, while there apparently devoting more attention to political activism than to medical studies. He became involved with a group of radicals led by Dmitry Karkasov, who in 1866 would attempt to assassinate Tsar Alexander II, leaving the university without finishing his degree in 1864. Peterson took a position as teacher of geography and arithmetic in the village of Bogorodsk, where, as we have seen, he met Fedorov, abandoned political radicalism, and became Fedorov's lifelong friend, disciple, and scribe. While teaching in Bogorodsk, where, as we have seen, he met... While teaching in Bogorodsk, Peterson and Fedorov met every day for walks, simple meals, and long discussions. One special memory for Peterson was an Easter week, when he joined Fedorov for his annual walk from Bogorodsk to Moscow, 21 miles, hearing from a distance all the city's church bells gradually ringing louder as they approached. In 1865, at his next position in Bronitsa, Peterson began to apply some of Fedorov's ideas and attempts to begin the common task by organizing a museum of local history and devising civic, agricultural, and ecological projects that allowed his pupils and their families to work together at putting newly acquired book knowledge into action. Just as these activities were beginning to have positive results, Peterson, as noted in Chapter 6, was arrested and sentenced to 6 months in prison for his former association with the Karakazov terrorist group. After his release in 1867, Peterson took a position as assistant to the librarian of the Chertkov Library in Moscow, where, among other duties, he transcribed materials for P.I. Baranev's Russky Archive, the foremost Russian monthly thick journal for history and documents. Another of his library duties was to assist with proof corrections for an edition of Tolstoy's War and Peace. In 1869, Peterson began to work in the Russian district court system and recommended Fedorov for the position he was leaving at the library. For the rest of his life, Peterson served the judicial system in various capacities and in various locations, first serving as a court clerk in a village near where he had grown up, then moving on to the nearby town of Mokshan, where he served as a judge, and then as district judge for the southeastern market city of Voronezh, and finally as judge for the district courts of Ashgabat in today's Turkmenistan, then in Verny, now Almaty in Kazakhstan, ending back in central Russia as judge in Zyraisk, Moscow district. During all this time, he kept in close touch with Fedorov, both in person and through correspondence. Nearly every year, Fedorov would spend his vacation with Peterson and his growing family, wherever they happened to live, and during these times together, Fedorov would dictate the long and short essays that would eventually find their way into the philosophy of the common task. It was, as we have seen, through one of the early dictated manuscripts that Peterson introduced Fedorov's ideas first to Dostoevsky, then to Tolstoy. And it was to Peterson's connections in Ashgabat, where he was a leading citizen and founding member of the local archaeological society, that Fedorov's ideas were first presented to a puzzled and largely antagonistic public. This initial public exposure, which Fedorov considered a debacle, affected Fedorov deeply and made him even more reluctant to present the common task to anyone beyond his narrow circle of friends and followers. Fedorov seems to have held Peterson partly responsible for the Ashgabat disaster, and in the last few years of his life, he began to distance himself from his first follower. After Fedorov's death in 1903, Peterson, devotion ever flagging, undertook the monumental job of editing and publishing the Philosophy of the Common Task in collaboration with his fellow disciple Vladimir Kozelnikov. And until his death in 1919, the promotion of Fedorov's book and ideas remained his principal task. Fedorov's other close friend and follower, Vladimir Kozelnikov, was born into a prominent family in the town of Kozlov in Tambov province. Between 1868 and 1872, he audited courses as an external non-degree student at Moscow University. And in 1872, at age 22, attracted favorable attention from leading intellectuals with his first scholarly publication, The Moral and Intellectual Development of Roman Society in the 2nd Century A.D. In the late 1870s, he began a multi-volume study of the process of secularization from the Italian Renaissance through the 19th century, 30 parts of which were apparently drafted before his death, but the work was never published, and the manuscript perished with the rest of the Kozelnikov archive in the 1930s. Although he did not have a university degree, Kozelnikov, like many of the Cosmist thinkers, was an independent scholar of great erudition. He had command of at least 8 languages and was a man of profound culture, in whom, in the words of one of his contemporaries, there dwelt the entire Academy of Sciences and Arts. He published over 20 books on religion and philosophy, the best known of which were The Philosophy of Feeling and Faith, Philosophia Shutsva I Veri, 1897, and Buddhism in Comparison with Christianity, Buddhism v Srovny s Kristinstvom, 2 volumes, 1916. Fedorov often cited Kozelnikov's poems and scholarly insights. Zenkovsky, in his standard history of Russian philosophy, gives favorable mention to Kozelnikov's philosophical work, and Solovyov, Florensky, Bulgakov, and other leading religious thinkers respected Kozelnikov as both a philosopher and a man. Kozelnikov met Fedorov in 1875. It was probably the Volodya mentioned by Tsiolkovsky as the leader of the late 1870s circle of young people who gathered around Fedorov in the library, where Peterson worked to present Fedorov's dictated writings to eminent contemporaries like Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and Solovyov. Kozelnikov absorbed Fedorov's ideas and, like Solovyov, incorporated Fedorovian themes into his own original philosophical and religious works. And while Peterson lived and worked in far-flung regions of the Russian Empire, Kozelnikov, staying in Moscow, was able to maintain close direct contact with Fedorov, contributed significantly to some of Fedorov's writings, and in frequent letters during the last 15 years of Fedorov's life, kept Peterson informed of their friend's fluctuating state of health and mind. From these letters, the difficulties that both Kozhevnikov and Peterson experienced in working with the Fedorov became clear. Fedorov did and did not want to publish his writings. He sincerely believed that his project could redirect the world from its disastrous course, but at the same time feared that if presented prematurely to the general public, the project would provoke such a storm of ridicule that it might never again be seriously considered. Nevertheless, in 1894, with the persuasion and help of Peterson and Kozhevnikov, Fedorov submitted to the censors an essay contrasting his philosophy of action with Tolstoy's philosophy of inaction. The plan was to issue the essay as an anonymous brochure, and in order to limit and control its circulation, the question was whether to make it too expensive for a wide public to buy or issue it not for sale and distribute it without charge to a closely selected readership. Fedorov chose the latter course, but when the censors prohibited publication of the essay, Fedorov was at once unsurprised yet deeply wounded. In the aftermath, he apparently blamed Kozhevnikov for having persuaded him to attempt publication, rebuked him both for offering to pay for the printing of the brochure and for having sent him some medicines when he was ill, and threatened to break off all relations with his Moscow friend. And as Kozhevnikov generously notes in another letter, breaking off all relations with his dearest friends was not a rare event in Fedorov's later years. Both in 1894 and between 1900 and 1902, he did the same with Peterson, apparently also in a dispute over publication, worrying correctly that Peterson, a sometimes overzealous enthusiast, was too eager to present his own incomplete and sometimes incorrect versions of Fedorov's ideas, and fearing also correctly that upon his death Peterson was planning to publish all of Fedorov's writings. At one point, to prevent premature and inaccurate presentation of the common task, Fedorov burned a great many of his own writings. But Kozhevnikov and Peterson loved Fedorov too much to be alienated by these brief flare-ups. His single-minded intensity, difficult as it made friendship with him, was one of his most endearing characteristics. Kozhevnikov was present at Fedorov's death, and his letter to Alexander Gorsky, written shortly afterwards, provides a touching and memorable description of their friend's last thoughts and hours. During his lifetime, Fedorov published nothing under his own name, and so very little pseudonymously and anonymously, that while his erudition, character, and eccentricities were known to many library patrons, his ideas were known to only a few of his contemporaries. Some, like Tsiolkovsky and the Bartenev publishing family, learned of his philosophy directly in dialogue, and others, including Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and Solovyov, through Peterson's privately circulated manuscript. Tolstoy and Solovyov were able to see Fedorov's ideas reflected in his life, while Dostoevsky admired Fedorov's thoughts on paper alone, without ever meeting him or even learning his name. After Fedorov's death in December 1903, Kozhevnikov and Peterson undertook the task of gathering, deciphering, editing, and publishing, at their own expense, the Philosophy of the Common Task, a massive 2-volume, 1,100-page miscellany of long and short essays, newspaper articles, letters to the editor, finished and unfinished works, drafts, fragments, variations on arguments developed more fully elsewhere, responses to books read, polemics with dead philosophers, and inspired jottings. The work as a whole reads like an unfinished first draft, a frequently eloquent but unsystematic call for action, a series of fresh attempts to develop a single enormous idea from different starting points. The 2 volumes published in 1906 and 1913, which Kozhevnikov and Peterson distributed gratis to libraries, academic institutions, and interested individuals, though printed in editions of only 480 copies, soon began to have an impact. Each of the 2 editors also published personal accounts of Fedorov and his ideas, Kozevnikov serially in 1904 to 1906, and in a monogram of 1908, and Peterson in a monograph of 1912. The editors made certain that influential reviewers received copies, resulting in important critical analysis by Bulgakov in 1912, Golovanenko, 1913 to 1915, Beryaev, 1915, and others, all of which soon helped to make Fedorov's idea and project an important part of the overall Promethean ethos that characterized the period. While not themselves cosmist thinkers, Peterson and Kozevnikov brought to light the ideas that would provide the basis and stimulation for all subsequent cosmic speculation. This was the first wave of posthumous Fedorovism. As we shall next see, a second wave of Fedorovism, sometimes directly and at other times indirectly connected to both the scientific and spiritual cosmists discussed previously in this study, would follow in the 1920s and be suppressed by the end of the 1930s. And as we shall see at the conclusion of this study, the third wave of Fedorovism, which fully identifies itself with Cosmism, began in the last years of Soviet rule and continues as an intellectual and cultural movement still growing today. Svyatogor and the Biocosmists. Not representative of the Fedorovist cosmist main tendency, but a notable, if weird, outgrowth was the short-lived biocosmist movement, led by the anarchistic activist and poet, the self-described rooster of revolution, Alexander F. Agienko, who wrote and performed publicity stunts under the ancient Slavic name Svyatogor. The writer and critic Boris Agapov describes him as a little man in a cheap tweed jacket, high-top boots with holes in them, wearing riding breeches, who in front of his wildly blinking eyes would spread all 10 fingers and wave them back and forth, as if searching for the right words. On every occasion and at every opportunity, he would declare that for humanity the time had come to inhabit outer space and to bring life to all the planets. Only therein lay poetry. All the rest was bullshit. And for that reason, he called himself a biocosmist. As one of the first to present semi-Fedorovian, semi-cosmist ideas to a post-revolutionary audience, Svyatogor did not always create a winning impression of the tendency. Berdyaev describes a debate in which he and an unnamed biocosmist, most likely the Rooster of Revolution, participated a few years after the October Revolution. A number of Tolstoyans, followers of Nikolai Fedderov, professing a mixture of Fedorov's ideas and anarchistic communism, some straightforward anarchists and communists also took part in the debate. As I entered the crowded hall, I had an almost physical sensation of terrific tension in the air. The crowd contained a great many Red Army men, sailors, and workers. The whole atmosphere was significant of the elemental forces behind the revolution, exulting in the downfall of intolerable restraints, wanton, unbridled, ruthless, and frank to the point of naked shamelessness. One worker read a paper on the gospel, in which he affirmed as scientifically proved that the Mother of God was a prostitute, and Jesus Christ the illegitimate son of a Russian soldier, a statement which was greeted with wild applause from the audience. He also dwelt incessantly on the contradictions and inconsistencies in the Gospels. He was followed by a Tolstoyan who made a sharp attack on the church, a follower of Fedorov, who described himself as a biocosmist, produced in what sounded like unprintable slang some incredible hodgepodge of science, Gnosticism, and the Gospels. He finished by proclaiming that since the maximum social program had already been put into practice, the cosmic resurrection of the dead will occur any moment. This statement provoked an uproar of laughter in the audience. The Biocosmists made news for about 2 years, in 1920 to 22, and included, in addition to Svyatogor, such now forgotten figures as Pavel Ivanitsky, Nikolai Degtaryev, V. Skiviv, and others. Perhaps 26 members in all. They had a presence in both Moscow and St. Petersburg, published the journal Immortality, Besmierti, rallied under the slogan Immortalism and Interplanetarianism, and issued a manifesto declaring two fundamental human rights: the right to exist forever and the right to unimpeded movement throughout interplanetary space. They viewed the struggle against nature and death as a logical continuation of the revolution's struggle against bourgeois culture. And as Berdyaev's debating opponent had proclaimed, the victory over the bourgeoisie meant that the victory over nature and death would inevitably follow. The biocosmists departed from Fedorov in their rejection of all that smacked of orthodoxy and monarchy, and in their emphasis of the creative individual rather than the all-embracing community. As one of the group's declarations stated, biocosmism is a new ideology for which the cornerstone principle is the concept of personhood, lishnost, growing in power and creativity to establish itself in immortality and in the cosmos. As real and essential rights of personhood, we consider the right to existence, immortality, resurrection, rejuvenation, and to freedom of movement throughout the cosmos. In contrast to the concept of brotherhood so important in Fedorov's thought, Svyatogor promises the concept of companionship, soratanivichestvo, which seems to him a more active, creative, mutual relationship than brotherhood, which he finds static, entirely subject to nature, and uncreative. Furthermore, as a revolutionary, not an archivist utopian, as he considers Fedorov to have been, Svyatogor places restoration of life to the dust of the fathers at the bottom, not the top of his to-do list. Svyatogor also wants to eliminate all religious Platonic dualism and derides all the absurdity of Fedorov's attempt to save Tsarism and orthodoxy. What Svyatogor and the biocosmists did take from Fedorov was the insistence that death is not inevitable, and that by our own efforts we can make individual human life limitless in both time and space. By accepting and further developing the immortalist element of Fedorov's thought, and at the same time rejecting the religious and political traditionalism, Svyatogor and the biocosmists anticipated not the cosmist tendency as a whole, which still treats science and religion as parts of a holistic unity, but the transhumanist, cryogenic, cyber-organist, and other branches of technological immortalism that have emerged both in Russia and internationally in recent decades. These later groups customarily grant Fedorov a tip of the hat, but do not attempt to defend or follow him. New Wine and the Universal Task. In 1912, a small group of Fedorovian religious thinkers and activists gathered in Moscow under the leadership of a former priest and later poet, publicist, and communist functionary Iona Briknevichev, and the previously mentioned former seminarian Alexander Gorsky, to publish a short-lived journal, New Wine, Novoe Vino, featuring poems, essays, and testimonials reflecting Fedorov's ideas. This was followed in 1914 by a miscellany published by the same Fedorovians, now based in Odessa under the title The Universal Task, Issue 1, Vyslensko Delo Vypusk 1. Although Briknevichev and Gorsky had been discussing the idea of such a miscellany for about 2 years, the collection itself does not reflect careful planning or good editorial judgment. Propagandistic poems and exhortations urging the victory of immortal life over death, similar in quality and style to the literature of revolution urging the proletariat to smite the bourgeoisie, were interspersed with energetical essays on Holy Scripture, scientific works on anabiosis, and the effects of cold temperature on certain organisms, and responses solicited from various writers on their concepts of death and resurrection. The eclectic nature of the selections, coupled with inconsistent editorial standards, helped to doom the project from the start. Peterson and Koznikov both declined the editor's invitation to contribute to the miscellany, fearing that it would turn out to be a vulgarization of Fedorov's ideas. To make matters worse, the scheduled publication date was December 1913, but production problems delayed the printing until the spring of 1914, coinciding almost exactly with the outbreak of World War I. The printers, who happened to be citizens of Germany and Austria-Hungary, were arrested, the presses were shut down, and all paper and printed materials were confiscated. The editors somehow managed to get a few dozen copies of their miscellany, which they distributed to a very few libraries and individuals. A bibliographic rarity, only a small handful of copies of the original Universal Task, Issue 1, are known to exist today. Bryknichev, the primary editor of both New Wine and the Universal Task, Issue 1, was born and grew up in Georgia and attended the same seminary and at approximately the same time as both Florensky and the future Stalin, then still Josip Dushkalvitsky. Dushavili. Bryknichev was a leader of Golgothan Christianity, a movement focused on suffering and emphasizing the need for radical communal action to redeem the fallen world. In 1906, Bryknichev was the editor of the Tbilisi weekly Christian newspaper Arise Sleeper, Viston Spiastri, and in 1907 was defrocked for political agitation. In the aftermath of the 1905 revolution, he worked closely with a group of Moscow religious Third Testament thinkers and seekers, including Vladimir Ern, Valentin Sventsky, Pavel Florensky, Dmitry Merezhkovsky, and Zinaida Gipius. He was one of the organizers in 1910 of the important religious journal New Land, Novaya Zemlya, and after it was banned, he collaborated with Gorsky, from whom he apparently first learned of Fedorov, to launch the Fedorovian journal mentioned above, New Wine. In 1913, he was expelled from Moscow and settled in Odessa, where he and Gorsky put together the doomed Universal Task, Issue 1. After the 1917 October Revolution, Bryknichev endorsed Soviet power and joined the Communist Party, sincerely believing that the new communist government would mean the realization of a selfless, truly Christian Fedorovian society. He served in a number of Soviet institutions, the Central Commission to Aid the Hungry, the All-Russian Commission to End Illiteracy, the Georgian Commission for Popular Enlightenment, and though a former priest, he even served on the editorial board of the major Soviet anti-religious journal, The Atheist, Bezbosknik. For as long as he was allowed, he continued to be a propagandist for Fedorovian ideas that were at least arguably compatible with Soviet policy, such as universal literacy, the unity of thought and action, and the deficiencies of the existing Orthodox Church. In a book published in 1931, The Book in the Lives of Great People, Giga Zizny Velik Liudai, Bryknichev was one of the first in an official Soviet publication of the Stalinist era actually to mention Fedorov's name in print. He died in a Moscow retirement home in 1968, one of the few outspoken followers of Fedorov to have survived the terror and hardships imposed by his former Georgian schoolmate, Dushavili Stalin. Alexander Konstantinovich Gorsky, 1886 to 1943, and Nikolai Alexandrovich Setnitsky, 1888 to 1937. The two major figures in the second wave of 20th century Fedorovism, assisting its transition to Cosmism, were Alexander Gorsky, who published under the pseudonyms A. Goronostayev and A. Ostromerov, and Nikolai Setnitsky, who published many works under his own name, as well as others anonymously and pseudonymously. As mentioned in the previous chapter, Gorsky was a leading proponent of the Fedorovian, and not only Fedorovian, idea of chaste marriage, in which husband and wife would abstain from sexual relations but otherwise share total love and devotion. As Gorsky points out, Fedorov anticipated Freud's insights into the power of the erotic instinct, the control over which would represent a significant stage in the evolution to a higher level of humanity, from pornocracy to psychocracy. In the present stage, men and women are prisoners of sex, defined when young largely by their potential as sexual partners, when old largely by their offspring, their sexual productions. In Gorsky's New Society, the new bodies which we shall create will be androgynous, and Eros will become a transformed, regulated version of the sex drive, a force for spiritual and cultural rather than merely physical creation. Gorsky was born into a priest's family, attended church school, religious academy, and seminary at the Holy Trinity Monastery, upon graduation from which, as one of the brightest in the class, he was offered a highly desirable clerical post in the capital, St. Petersburg. But he turned this down to follow instead, as Svetlana Smirnova has suggested, the path of Dostoevsky's Aloyshka Karamazov, the monk in the world. He studied for a year at Moscow University, then settled in Odessa, where he taught at a religious academy and church school. He published poems and essays in the journal New Wine, then collaborated with Brekhennichev to edit and publish the ill-fated Fedorovian miscellany, The Universal Task, Issue 1. In 1918, he met Stepnitsky at a literary gathering and introduced him to Fedorov's thought, thus beginning their 20 years of close friendship and collaboration. In the early 1920s, back in Moscow, Gorsky and Stepnitsky wrote articles for a weekly journal on the rational scientific method to organize labor, and then together anonymously issued a very strange pamphlet, Smrt tu Bozhenichevsko, The Apotheosis of Death, a militant demand for the total transformation of society towards Fedorovian goals, ending with a grim series of anathemas upon all who have ignored or rejected the common task. Gorsky's friend and collaborator, Stepnitsky, grew up in a civil service family, attended a classical grammar school, and initially studied Oriental languages, then law, at St. Petersburg University. Like others in the Cosmist tendency, Stepnitsky was interested in all branches of knowledge, and in addition to his major subjects in the humanities, took courses in physics and mathematics. Later, while working primarily as an economist and statistician, he would publish articles and books on a very wide range of topics, applying Fedorov's ideas to all facets of 20th century society and culture, always following Fedorov's example and looking for the higher goal, the ultimate ideal toward which any activity pointed, condemning those that pointed toward death and exalting those that pointed towards new eternal life. In 1925, Stepnitsky moved to Harbin, China, where he spent the next 10 years working in the economic office of the Chinese Eastern Railway and teaching as a member of the legal faculty of this technical institute. Harbin at that time enjoyed the unusual advantage of being a city with a strong Russian cultural presence, but not under Soviet control, and thus was a center in which many Russian émigrés temporarily resided or through which they passed on their way to new homelands. Stepnitsky was able to use Harbin as a base from which to publish Fedorovian materials that could not be published in Soviet Russia. In 1928, he published a second edition of sections of the first volume of the Philosophy of the Common Task, accompanied by a substantial, if in places inaccurate, biographical work on Fedorov by Gorsky, writing as A. Ostromirov. Other books and booklets written by Gorsky and Stepnitsky under various pseudonyms analyzed Fedorov's influence on Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and Solovyov, and related the common task to major 20th century Russian and international intellectual and cultural developments. It is in Gorsky's and Stepnitsky's application and extension, rather than simple elucidation, of Fedorov's ideas that we see the beginnings of the transition from strict Fedorovism to its broader outgrowth and upgrade, Cosmism. Where Gorsky were especially interested in the psychological implications of Fedorov's ideas, Stepnitsky focused more on the socio-economic mandates of the common task. In his book on the ultimate ideal, O Konechnom Ideal, Stepnitsky considers current Soviet willingness to use but unwillingness to credit certain of Fedorov's ideas. In this connection, there are many instances of proposed and realized Fedorovian ideas, though his name, as painted always in strongly religious colors, is not mentioned, and even the idea and connection of these projects with Fedorov's conceptions is not recognized. Thus, a clear example in this area is the receptivity on the part of the Soviet policymakers to the direction Fedorov initiated on the struggle against drought. Recent 1931 actions and government declarations in this area appear copied whole from the pages of the Philosophy of the Common Task. And one could also say the same concerning the latest projects for the exploitation of the water routes of the USSR. Concerning exploration and development of the Russian and Siberian far north, concerning the construction and direction of railways, concerning irrigation in Turkestan, etc. In 1934, through printers at Riga, at that time in independent Latvia, Setnitsky published the Universal Task Issue 2, which included valuable obituaries of Peterson and Kozhevnikov, bibliographies and materials that Peterson and Kozhevnikov had intended to include in their never-published third volume, The Philosophy of the Common Task. And in several successful issues of Izvestia Ierdyshevskogo, Fakulteta v Grod Karabin, Proceedings of the Department of the Law in the City of Harbin, Setnitsky published essays and articles on Fedorovian themes, many of which later appeared as separate brochures. Setnitsky also sent Fedorovian materials to Berdyaev and other leading émigré writers and publishers, resulting in excerpts from Fedorov's writings and commentary on them in leading émigré, religious, and Eurasian movement journals in Paris and Berlin. From Harbin, Setnitsky carried on an extensive correspondence with Maxim Gorky, who was not only a leading Soviet writer, but also a major force in the Soviet publishing industry, concerning the possibility of an official Soviet edition of Fedorov's writings. Gorky had long been interested in Fedorov's ideas, and while dismissing his religious views, strongly admired his activist approach to all life problems. In letters to receptive Soviet writers such as Mikhail Prizfin and Olga Forsh, Gorky wrote about his interest in and agreement with some of Fedorov's ideas. But the mid-1930s was not the right time to push for a Soviet edition of Fedorov. As Solzhenitsyn tells us, Fedorov had become one of the non-persons whose ideas were generally understood to be in disgrace. Gorsky, who had been arrested in 1929, spent most of the 1930s in prison. Setnitsky, who returned to Russia from Harbin in 1935, was arrested and executed in 1937. And Maxim Gorky himself died under suspicious circumstances in 1936. By the end of the decade, while some of his uncredited projects were being implemented, Fedorov and his followers and his ideas were still discussed privately, but could not even be whispered about in public. After his release from prison in 1937, Gorsky spent his exile in Kaluga, where Tsiolkovsky had died and Chizevsky still lived. There, until his arrest and death in prison in 1943, he developed close ties with his spiritual daughters, Setnitsky's daughters Olga and Elena, and their friend Ekaterina Krasheninnikova, a young Fedorovian enthusiast who hid and preserved the archives of both Setnitsky and Gorsky until they could be safely brought again into the light. Setnitsky's youngest daughter, Elena Burakovskaya, who died in 1998, left a vivid reminiscence about her father's friendship with Gorky and enthusiasm for Fedorov. Setnitsky had earlier tried unsuccessfully to convert his wife and older daughter Olga to Fedorov's teachings, but when Gorsky arrived at their home in 1937 after 10 years in prison camps, he was able to accomplish, largely by the force of his smile and personality, the conversions that his friend Setnitsky had not. After Setnitsky was arrested and, unknown to his family and friends, executed in 1937, Gorsky became father, friend, teacher, and shepherd to the Setnitsky girls and their friend, Katya Krasheninnikova. Alexander Konstantinovich was by nature a man of action. Konstantinovich. I would even say that he was a fiery agitator and promoter of N.F. Fedorov's ideas in the world. He wrote great works with the intent of restoring Fedorov's ideas to life. Yes, precisely to life, in that most terrible time about which one speaks with fear and trembling. Alexander Konstantinovich and Puna, family nickname for Setnitsky, thought and hoped that our centralized form of government could and should use its powers to encourage developments in the fields of biology, medicine, and chemistry directed towards the prolongation of human life, the struggle against aging, and the regulation of nature. Thinking as others had that Fedorov's teachings coincide perfectly with Soviet objectives, Setnitsky and Gorsky, both at first, then Gorsky alone, sent letters to leading Soviet writers and officials outlining Fedorov's ideas and asking for official help in propagating them. In 1942, Gorsky apparently even wrote a letter to Stalin, thinking it might gain Setnitsky's release from the Gulag, not realizing that his friend had long since been executed. After Gorsky's arrest, the Setnitsky daughters and their friends continued to write letters about Fedorov and his teachings to important figures in Soviet literature and culture, including Boris Pasternak, Ilya Ehrenberg, Vladimir Vernadsky, and Marina Tsvetaeva. Going beyond letters, Setnitsky's daughters and friends managed to establish an ongoing personal relationship with Pasternak and were present at an early private reading by him of the opening chapters of his most Fedorovian work, Dr. Zhivago. The transcripts of Gorsky's own interrogations in 1928 to 1929 and 1943 reveal an apostle who openly professed Fedorov's teachings, knowing they would lead to a death sentence. In the questioning from 1928 to 1929, he went into great detail about what was compatible and incompatible between Fedorov's project and Soviet policy. He spoke freely about his proselytizing efforts, his attempts to contact potentially interested thinkers and activists, and his disappointment at the indifferent or negative response on the part of people from whom he had high hopes of agreement. In his responses to the interrogator's questions, he holds nothing back. Asked, "Are you a mystic?" he replies frankly, "Yes, I'm a mystic, but I think that mysticism ought to lead a path of great scientific progress. I'm an advocate of Fedorov's teachings." His tone in all these responses is candid, even helpful, as though he still believed that he could be both a Fedorovian and a loyal Soviet citizen. His confession reveals a conviction shared by other cosmists that mysticism and science were not incompatible. He sincerely believed that in confessing commitment to the common task, he was confessing to an acceptable variation of official ideology, not to a criminal heresy. But in 1943 he knew otherwise, and both the interrogator's questions and Gorsky's responses contained none of the earlier comradely spirit. Question. You are accused of counter-revolutionary espionage against the Soviet government. Stop denying and begin a frank account of your treacherous activities. Answer. I accepted the revolution and Soviet power because they contained that which moved humanity forward, toward realization of the dream of controlling all the forces of nature, right up to the complete liquidation of nature's idiocies, death and dying. But in actuality, I see the same petty bourgeois submission to nature and absence of the struggle for the realization of ideals and dreams, and I can't reconcile myself to it. Question. Don't hide under flowery phrases. Are you an enemy of Soviet power? Do you openly admit it? Answer. I have never been an enemy of Soviet power, but I had a suspicious and somewhat negative attitude towards certain representatives of that power. For example, towards Bukharin, Yagoda, Zinoviev, that's 3 high Soviet officials executed for notorious show trials for anti-Soviet behavior, and the like. Question. You continue to avoid a direct answer about your counter-revolutionary activities. Have courage. Tell yourself A, to talk, and B, not to be evasive. Answer. I refuse to testify. Question. Why? Answer. If you wish, I can say directly. I don't want to give evidence because I am an enemy of Soviet power, was, am, and will remain so. My convictions have not developed accidentally, and I am not at an age to change them. Therefore, I do not wish to testify to you. Decide the question regarding me and don't drag out the investigation. Question. You have to tell us in concrete terms about your counter-revolutionary activities. Answer. I refuse to give any testimony for the previously indicated reason. Question. That you are an enemy of Soviet power, that is known. As proof of this, we can submit the impudent declaration you have just made. But this declaration is insufficient, because it does not present a detailed account of your treacherous espionage activities and says nothing about your counter-revolutionary connections. Therefore, the investigation insists upon full and open testimony. Answer. I have already said that I refuse to give any kind of testimony. Question. This position of yours is incorrect. We insist on continuing the testimony. Answer. I will not be giving testimony. Interrogation ended 11th of May, 1943, 5 o'clock. In addition to having propagated the teachings of Fedorov, Gorsky had helped to keep the local church open and the cemetery functioning through the German occupation of Kaluga, which to his interrogators meant collaboration with the enemy. He was found guilty of all charges and executed on June 2nd, 1943. In Gorsky and Setnitsky we find extraordinary energy and courage, if not the intellectual originality that we find in Tsiolkovsky, Vernadsky, Beryaev, Florensky, and the other major cosmists. Their efforts were directed toward proving the continued relevance of Fedorov's grand project, the insistence that Fedorov was a thinker for the future rather than a relic of the past. They were, in the best sense, presenters rather than innovators, propagandists rather than objective scholars. In their view, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and Solovyov owed their best ideas to Fedorov. And in the 20th century, the discoveries of the greatest new geniuses, Einstein, Freud, Bohr, and the rest, had largely been anticipated by that obscure 19th century Moscow librarian. Gorsky and Setnitsky's main contribution to the Cosmist movement was that through their republication of Fedorov, their own writings, their personal contacts, and their persistent letters, they continued to bring Fedorov's ideas to the attention of major creative thinkers who would take Fedorov's ideas further than he, even with his powerful imagination, was able to extend them. Thus, they contributed enormously to the transition from strict Fedorovism to Cosmism, a movement that would extend and at the same time depart from Fedorov's common task. Valerian Nikolaevich Muravyov, 1885 to 1932. Another Fedorovian and genuine cosmist who tried to continue to work within the Soviet system, and who went considerably farther beyond Fedorov than his friends Sinitsky and Korsky, was Valerian Muravyov, a philosopher, poet, diplomat, and descendant of a long line of distinguished public servants. Well-traveled and educated in Western European schools, Muravyov, despite his initial monarchist and anti-Bolshevik leanings, became useful to the Soviet government in his early struggles, mainly because of his acknowledged brilliant intellect, his fluency in several languages, a background that immediately earned the trust and respect of outsiders, and, though this later became a handicap, a close acquaintanceship with Leon Trotsky. Like many young intellectuals from the upper nobility, Muravyov quickly abandoned his anti-Bolshevist prejudices and became an enthusiastic supporter of the revolution. As he discovered only too soon, however, his idea of a revolution and the revolution that actually emerged were only distantly related. Muravyov, as much as esotericist as a Marxist, wanted a total alchemical transformation of the individual in the cosmos. He wrote much but was able to publish very little during his lifetime. An essay on Russian spirituality and intellectual history called The Roar of the Tribe, Rev Plemeni, for the important 1918 collection of dissident essays on the revolution, De Profundis Izgubini, and an essay on universal productive mathematics, Vyzbyshkaya Proizvoditnaya Matematika, in the 1934 Fedorovian Miscellany, The Universal Task, Issue 2. While working on projects for various Soviet government institutions, he wrote and published at his own expense a remarkable little book, his masterpiece called Control Over Time, Ovladany Vremenem, in which, without mentioning Fedorov, he proposes a common task for restructuring the human being, uniting all humanity, and overcoming death, all by means of controlling time. Muravyov's version of Fedorov's regulation of nature. In his introduction to Control Over Time, Muravyov writes that parallel to but different from the mathematical discoveries of Einstein, he wishes to investigate the question of time, not theoretically but practically, and not in a laboratory but in history and society, based on the Russian Revolution's experience in the total organization of society. Einstein's theories, too, then become the basis for a new sociology. For Muravyov, the revolution was, among other things, a vast experiment in directing and steering the masses in a planned, predetermined direction toward a specific goal, an experiment in the scientific organization of labor. The problem of mastering time is none other than the further deepening of the problem of the scientific organization of labor, especially that part of the science that relates to the utilization of time. utilization which passes into the control over time. Using Fedorov's terminology without mentioning his name, Muravyov writes that the problem of time is the problem of human control over the world's blind, inert forces. Einstein's theory of relativity suggests that there are multiple time frames, which Muravyov calls simply multiple times, each associated with a known system and therefore different and relative. At the same time, recent experiments in biological rejuvenation, specifically Bogdanov's experiments in rejuvenation through blood transfusion, suggested to Muravyov that in limited circumstances and within limited boundaries, time becomes reversible. Multiplicity and reversibility of time then becomes two qualities that lead, at least in principle, though not yet completely in daily reality, to human control over time. For time, he argues, is nothing but change and movement and change are functions of multiplicity, nozovesko, in the sense that in changing, one thing becomes another thing, and a unit becomes a series. The key to overcoming time, thus, lies in our ability to manage multiple things. In terms of history and society, Muravyov's example of managing multiplicity is in the recognition of the potential importance of the human collective, and in the search for methods to organize and extend the collective to achieve rational goals for humanity. In Muravyov's view, to be effective, both subject and object, director and directed, must be multiple. Thus, the collective, and not the isolated great individual, is the effective shaper and director of humanity. Control over time will come, then, not from a lone inventor sitting in a time machine, as in the story by H.G. Wells, but from a collective, eventually all humanity joined in common task to rearrange the order of things in sets of multiples. Muravyov gives as a simple laboratory example of controlling time the collective of combining hydrogen and oxygen to form water, then separating the elements back into hydrogen and oxygen, then combining them once more into water, which Muravyov describes as a limited form of time reversal and resurrection. The task of collective intelligence and efforts is to deepen and broaden these limited forms of simple rearrangement of elements into the rearrangements of complex sets of multiples that would lead to one resurrection and rejuvenation of human beings. Following the Pythagoreans, Muravyov holds that all things are, in essence, numbers, and that even human beings are basically multiple sets of numbers. Extremely complex sets designated by extremely complex formulas, to be sure, but nevertheless numbers quantifiable and therefore eventually replicable. Like everything else in the cosmos, we are multiples, and the many things that constitute us can be arranged and reordered. So control over time means also control over ourselves, individually and collectively. For as individuals, we exist only in relation to others, and therefore only as parts of a greater collective. And that collective exists as part of an even greater collective, and so on, in greater and greater collectives, until each individual is connected to every other individual, and to everything living and not living, past, present, and future. In this way, each individual person is part of the entire cosmos, and related to every particle in both the microcosm and the macrocosm. Muravyov asks us to imagine two lines extending from our individuality, one extending back into what we think of the past, the other extending forward into what we consider the future. These two lines connect us to all that has been and will be, the difference being that what we consider the past is given to us, and what we consider the future is what we shall make. The project whose goal now exists in our mind as something thought or imagined, but which with effort we can attempt to realize and transform into a fact, a given, moving it on to the imaginary line from the propulsive future to the realized past. Our position, then, is the midpoint between world of given facts and the world of projects. Another form of control over time, then, is the ability to choose what will and what will not move from what we consider to be the future into what we consider to be the past. As Muravyov argues, in mathematics one can change the sign to reverse the process. In philosophy, such reversibility is possible for any sequence of events in which the cause would become the purpose or the purpose would become the cause. And if we can ad libitum install such a sequence, we thus control time. As his version of the time of multiple times, Muravyov emphasizes two kinds of time: inner time, which represents freedom, and external time, which represents necessity. To a degree, we already control inner time. In a race, for example, a runner speaks of his or her time. Different in duration, but the same in space and goal or purpose as another runner's time. External time is clock and calendar time, independent of our goals and efforts. We can change, repeat, or reverse inner time, but not external time. But if we consider my own movements, which I may take and repeat, this is change under my control. If we made a clock and calendar to correspond to my movements, rather than to the sun's, it would not simply be gradual and unidirectional, but would have to include retreats, repetitions, and restarts. In other words, they would show instances of the redirection and resumption of time. Also, if I completed a job twice as fast as another person, it would show that I made a time different from the one he made. I can write a word or not write. In this framework, I have the power, but the power I have is only relative, because I am isolating the movement from the world of determinism, which governs it. Again, this is a partial, limited form of control over time, and the task of the collective is to extend and deepen this limited control to a scope much greater and more significant, eventually to control over time throughout the cosmos. Consciousness is the key. If we take a system of entirely unconscious elements, time and motion are wholly necessary and determined. This is blind action, and time subject entirely to external laws. This is like a subject in a dictatorship. Everything becomes different when consciousness is present. Here, control over time is possible. Collective consciousness, obtained when consensus is present in the system, is the guide that must shape and direct the blind force of necessity, overcoming both time and death. In Fedorov, this guidance was to be provided by a task force of the learned, and Muravyov, councils, soviets of scientists and scholars, are to be the guiding force for the common task in science. Arts councils and economic councils are to lead the task for other systems. A supreme council is to be the council of councils, the council of the Soviet of soviets. The proper task for scientists is the creation of a genetically new humanity. For artists, the creation of works that will inspire the collectives to pursue their tasks energetically, and for economists, the task is to create a new organization of labor. For Muravyov, medieval European art is to create a new organization of labor. For Muravyov, medieval European art serves as an example of a movement in which all architecture, literature, music, and visual creation were united in service to a single worldview and a single task of salvation. What is needed is not a regression to that worldview, but similar unity, intensity, and energy directed towards a new worldview appropriate to our epoch with its emphasis on collective identity and action. Medieval art projected a symbolic victory. The new art must project and embody a real victory over time and death. Mystics and spiritual visionaries of all ages have envisioned a unity between man and the cosmos, but until now, Muravyov observes, that unity has been merely symbolic, transitory, and usually attained by individual spiritual effort, such as prayer and meditation. But individual victories are illusory. The goal of unity with the cosmos, which a dreaming mind thinks to attain by means of direct individual association with the All-One, which is supposed to provide some kind of eternal existence, is in fact attained by other means, through collective historical action. Time can be overcome only by regulating it, that is, only within time, in the historical process of collective action. In this action there is created that which the dreaming meditator dreams of. Muravyov, like other Russian thinkers with a totalitarian cast of mind, believes that the best victory, like the best bus tour, is one that totally organized, the one with the least possibility of accidental discovery of spontaneous development. Our goal should be the total organization of culture, with carefully planned goals to fulfill and carefully devised incentives to ensure that goals are realized. Organization of culture begins with control of knowledge, which for Muravyov, as for many Russian thinkers, is of much higher priority than freedom of inquiry. Philosophy should be theory realizing itself in activity. Consciousness means primarily to be conscious that every present action is connected to every past and future action, mine and everyone's. If everyone acted with that consciousness, the common task in overcoming of time would be possible. Muravyev cites the American pragmatist philosophers John Dewey and William James as sources for his ideas on time. But the great difference is that the pragmatists, especially James, emphasize the individual variations in what works, i.e. it is acceptable that what works for me may not work for you, whereas Muravyev and Russians in general, what works must work for all. Individual creativity is not a positive goal for Muravyev's ideal society. He submits that art and culture today are not truly free, but are representative of a worldview dictated by commercial and other powerful interests. According to Muravyev, today's art is degenerate and needs to be reborn. Originality is an illusion. One person or one group rearranges given materials to accord with his or her personal interests or even character defects, and if that rearrangement is particularly attractive or well promoted and therefore commercially successful, everyone else follows. Instead of being directed by commerce and random personal preferences and disorders, Muravyev argues, culture should be collectively organized to bring about a desired collective result, namely, the transformation of humanity, the control over time, and the defeat of death. Muravyev takes the Masonic Rosicrucian view that art and architecture should build human character as well as construct images and edifices. He envisions a future architecture represented by new versions of ziggurats, pyramids, onion domes, and New York-style skyscrapers with huge antennas beaming energy outward toward and receiving it inward from the cosmos. An important part of control over time is control over the process of human reproduction. Genetics has as its main goal to create the most perfect of creatures known to us, people. Besides the general fact of creation, the birth of people in this age are from mating of the two sexes through a woman. It is a fact unimportant, casual, and temporary. There was a time in the history of life when our ancestors, some primitive animals or plants, were directed by direct division. There will be a time when perhaps the birth process will be streamlined and moved to the laboratory. In time, people will create not merely things but living things, and not merely living but conscious and rational things. We must create a population of superhuman, not in the sense of Nietzsche's blonde beast, but in the sense of a future perfect and powerful creature, with a cosmic perspective and cosmic power. The creation of a human being is a real overcoming of time in the sense of confirming the constancy of individuality against the corrosive force of time. Like Fedorov, Muravyev belongs to the very long and broad tradition of Russian thought that places the interests of the collective above the interests of the individual, or that defines the individual's interest as realizable only through the collective. What he calls cosmocratic government has as its task to mold humans psychologically and socially, as science molds them genetically. Cosmocracy should create a single all-human, all-world culture, in which people would not be chaotically at liberty to pursue their own egotistical ends, but would all be part of a single task. Industry presently creates objects not for overcoming time, but for passing time. People now consider not how to overcome time and eternalize life, but how to kill time, how to spend the time remaining until the hour of death. This is the basis of all present culture. The synthesis of the person, litso, and the collective, collective, in Muravyev is instrumentality, in which the individual owns his own tools and does his own work, but as an instrument of a broader, higher, all-human cause. I can be free and fulfilled only as part of the greater we. For the antithesis within a Russian context, see Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, or Zamyatin's anti-utopian novel We. But Muravyev, as a 20th century thinker writing in times of revolution and civil war, goes beyond Fedorov to say that in the event of recalcitrance or opposition, coercion is in order. He writes that agreement is always and everywhere considered to be useful, beautiful, and good, while discord or strife is held to be ugly, bad, even evil. Discord, and only discord, stands as a possible obstacle to control over time. For control to happen, it must be total, and to be total, everyone must participate. So what is to be done with those who refuse to participate? In the end, the only obstacle to control over time is strife manifested as unenlightened beings by hostile separation, for enlightened beings as confusion of their efforts, and sometimes open mutual struggle. In reality, no one is either wholly enlightened or unenlightened, but mixed. So those who are more conscious of their being part of multiplicity, collective consciousness, should be active and lead those less conscious. The neutralization of the malevolent activity of strife, salvation from the annihilating flow of certain events, the partial victory over time, is attained by the submission of the blind elements to the higher ones, by means of a dictatorship of the latter. Ideally, but only with all participating in the common task, agreement would be total and voluntary. But unconscious strife impedes the common task. Therefore, what can be accomplished with the help of the unenlightened is very limited. The task is to transform the unenlightened into the enlightened. Coercion may be used against those who create obstacles to the common task. So here we have the unintended philosophical link between Fedorov's common task and the coercive policies conducted in Soviet times, which theoretically were for the good of all, but in practice meant the liquidation or death by deprivation of millions of people, including Muravyov. In a posthumously published autobiographical sketch included in a 1998 reprint of Ovladeni Vremenem, Muravyov writes that he had passed through the stages of interest in religion, religious heresies, Pythagoreanism, Neoplatonism, Freemasonry, Theosophy, and the ideas of the Illuminati before finding his real calling, working through Soviet agencies for the betterment of the people. Despite this apparently sincere declaration, and despite or perhaps because of his close relationship with Trotsky, he was arrested as an enemy of the people in 1929 and sent to work in a meteorological station in the far north where he died of typhus in 1931 or 1932. Vasily Nikolaevich Chekirgin, 1897 to 1922. As we noted in our look at Prometheanism, many 20th century Russian artists and writers, major and minor, worked Fedorovian or Cosmist themes into their compositions. Among prominent visual artists, Kazimir Malovich, Vasily Kandinsky, and Pavel Filanov. In music, Alexander Scriabin, and in literature, Alexander Blok, Andrei Biely, Vladimir Mayakovsky, Sergei Esenin, Anna Akhmatova, Marina Sevestaeva, Andrei Platonov, Nikolai Zabolotsky, and Boris Pasternak have all exhibited to one degree or another Fedorovian and Cosmist concerns. But the figure in all the arts whose work most clearly reflect Fedorovian and Cosmist themes is the now relatively obscure visual artist Vasily Shekrygin. All the others listed above can be and have been understood and appreciated on grounds independent of any reference to Fedorov and Cosmism, but not Shekrygin. Knowledge of Fedorov and the Cosmists may add to our understanding of all the others, but without knowledge of Fedorov and the Cosmists, Shekrygin cannot be understood at all. Shekrygin, who either fell or threw himself under a train at age 25, was considered to be one of the brightest and most promising of the many talented Russian artists who came of age during the years of the Revolution. At age 13, he performed brilliantly, according to one commentator, on the examination for the Academy of Painting, Sculpture, and Architecture, where he became a Levitan Fellow. One of his fellow student artists at the Academy was the poet Vladimir Mayakovsky, and at age 16, Shekrygin was chosen to illustrate Mayakovsky's first book of poems. Like the English Romantic poet-artist William Blake, Shekrygin interwove the handwritten texts and illustrations into a unique lithographic synthesis of verbal and visual art. An early representative of the Russian avant-garde, both as a theorist and as a practicing artist, Shekrygin became acquainted with Fedorov's teachings around 1920, an influence that gradually changed the focus and direction of his art. No longer sharing his futurist friend's desire to heave aboard from the ship of modernity the great works of the past, Shekrygin turned his gaze toward the past, studied Egyptian art, antiquity, the Renaissance, the old Russian icons, and concluded that it was necessary to strengthen ties with traditions of the past and make an attentive study of old art. He turned from earlier cubist, semi-abstract, and non-representational creations to heroic, semi-realistic images from the past and the present. The 17th century Cossack rebel Stenka Razin, figures from more recent uprisings, scenes from the Bolshevik Revolution, all elevated to superhuman scale, icons for transformation to a new world. Fully developed, his new cosmist aesthetic led him undertake, as his intended masterpiece, a project of frescoes intended for a proposed future equivalent to the Sistine Chapel, a cathedral of the Museum of Resurrecting, illustrating the actual resurrecting of the dead and the flight of the newly resurrected bodies upward toward their new abodes in the cosmos. With Pavel Florensky, the poet Vladimir Klebnikov, and others, Shekrygin took a leading role in the Makovets movement, a union of spiritually but also futuristically inclined artists and thinkers, named for the hill upon which St. Sergius laid the foundations for the Holy Trinity Monastery. It was through Makovets, and especially through his discussions and sometimes disagreements there with Florensky, that Shekrygin confirmed his views on the purpose of art. Like the biocosmist, Shekrygin advocated an art that would transform man in the world, but unlike the biocosmists, who held that no God was necessary for the transformation, Shekrygin, now a devout, if not traditionally orthodox believer, saw this transformation as a task for a new, active Christianity. With Florensky, he understood the divine liturgy, with its flickering lights, aromas of incense, colors of icons and costumes, sculptures and poetic solo and choral musical cadences within curved walls and under curved domes, to be synthesis of all the arts, greater than anything conceived by Wagner, Nietzsche, or Scriabin. But when Florensky believed that the liturgy as traditionally performed in the Orthodox Church represented that synthesis, Shekrygin argued for the more Fedorovian idea of liturgy outside the walls of the Church. Vnekraimovaya liturgia. And like Fedorov, by liturgy outside the walls of the Church, Shekrygin meant that literal physical reconstruction of man and the restoration of life to the dead. As within the Church, the liturgy celebrates the mystical transformation of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, so outside the Church walls, the liturgy should begin the real transformation of the dust of ancestors into living bodies. For Shekrygin, as for Fedorov, the simple belief that the dead go to heaven is reinterpreted to mean that the resurrected ancestors will go out into space to populate and, in spirit, the currently uninhabited, soulless regions of the universe. For Shekrygin, art should not merely represent life in the world, but should become the creative means to save the world. With Fedorov, he believes that while intellectually abstractly we may recognize that we live in a Copernican universe in which the Earth orbits the Sun, emotionally and in every other way we still live in a Ptolemaic universe in which the Sun circles the Earth every day, and art must guide our emotional as well as intellectual transition into the Copernican worldview. All art of the Ptolemaic worldview, i.e. contemplative, cubism, supremacism, naturalism, and Tatianism, is one and the same unnecessary creation of an illusion, a likeness of what is being lived in what has been lived. Genuine art does not submit to the law of the fall body's gravitation. It is not doomed to death and destruction. Genuine art saves the falling world from death, rebuilds it. The highest creation, the greatest product of all art, is humanity itself. Man is the synthesis of the truest living arts, but man is imperfect, needs support, and is condemned to death. Man is a museum, not only of natural history, for in that case he would be a passive and dead, but instead he is an active agent. He is master of reason. Nature's reason is in him, according to the researches of the positivists, in accordance with the law of association, memory. What is subjectively remembrance will objectively become the activity of resurrecting. What is subjectively oblivion, objectively, is death. What is subjectively the preservation of connections, association, objectively, is consciousness of kinship. Shakrogin's fullest statement of his cosmist worldview in literary form is a longish prose poem on the cathedral of the Museum of Resurrecting, written in rhythmical cadences reminiscent of Ecclesiastes and the Psalms. It begins, I who have lived in pain and trouble write this book and believe that the days will come when in its lofty plan will become the task of man. After several sections in which he presents images of the chaos and ruin prevalent throughout the history of the world, he announces the uprising. Vostani. Your body is of stars. In infinity, a brightly burning star once broke out of its inert course and moved toward a beckoning star, and on its loving path scattered its fiery seeds, and still cherishing, fled toward perfection. But with the dead of the stars, with universal discord, with the dying of the world, there came into being you. The newly created being is not an animal, not subject to nature only, but a rational being who assumes an upright posture. The Fedorovian triumph of the vertical over the horizontal, the first step toward control over nature and eventual victory over death. In poetic prose, Shakragin then gradually takes his reader step by step through the Fedorovian tasks of transformation of the world, regulation of the cosmic process, resurrecting the dead fathers, Eucharist beyond the church walls, and ascension and construction, Copernican architecture. He ends with a prayer that goes a small step beyond Fedorov, specifically including mothers and daughters in the resurrecting process along with the fathers and sons. At his death, Shakragin left some 1,500 works, many of them charcoal sketches toward his grand unfinished project of frescoes for the never-begun cathedral of the Museum of Resurrecting. The sketches are of figures and scenes from both the present and falling world and the projected world of the resurrection, mostly nude prodigal sons and prodigal daughters, feasting over the graves of their ancestors, scenes from the world of empty pleasure, discord and death, then shadowy figures, both male and female, with confused and sometimes frightened expressions, being caught up in the whirlwind of revolution and resurrection. The figures at the bottom of the whirlwinds, those just beginning to be resurrected, are heavier, flashier, and sometimes disfigured, while those higher up are lighter and more nearly transparent. Shakragin then attempted to devote his artistic gift to visualizing the actual Fedorovian process of resurrecting the ancestors in the cosmic vision, of resettling them in the other parts of the universe. He attempts at least an artistic solution to such problems as how the bodies will look, and how they will differ from earthly bodies. But as both Fedorov and Shakragin repeated time and again, projection by the aesthetic imagination, while a necessary first step, is precisely that, just a first step. To go beyond that first step, science must be joined to spirituality and art. In the next chapter, as we look at Cosmism in post-Soviet Russia, we shall see that some scientists have indeed gone beyond those first steps. Thus concludes Chapter 11 of 1111 of the Russian Cosmists by George Young. When you hear me next, I will be starting with section 1112, chapter 12. Until then, I will see you then. Olam.